to it hopefully later. We're also glad to have our esteemed panelists, Francesco, Shruti, and Apar. I would let them introduce themselves, and then I will give a little introduction about the Institute as well as the cycle and what we will be hopefully covering during the course of an hour. I think, can I ask Francesco to go first because he's the first one I can see on my screen.
Sure. Thanks, Rashan. So you wanted me to introduce myself?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi. So good evening from Manila. So I'm Paco Pangalangan. I go by Paco. That's my nickname, Paco Pangalangan. I'm here as the convener of a citizen-led organization called Democracy Watch Philippines. And we advocate for good governance, transparency and accountability, electoral reform, and of course, along the way, the topic of disinformation and the need for the right kind of information. It has popped up as well as things that we advocate for along the way. So yeah, so that's just briefly about me, please.
Thank you. Can I have Apar and then Shruti, please?
Hi, my name is Apar Gupta. I'm the Executive Director at the Internet Freedom Foundation. I'm a lawyer by training, and my particular field of work is at the intersection of fundamental rights and technology. In India, there is a growing number of internet users, and there's a great potential for technology to advance fundamental rights, but it also quite often threatens individual freedoms as well as social justice. So the organization that I work at, Internet Freedom Foundation, it's domestically funded by individuals as well as organizations which support us and works much more towards advocacy, utilizing the research which emerges from scholars and academics from all over the world as well as in India. I look forward to this panel, and thank you so much for this generous invitation.
Shruti?
Hi, I'm Shruti Shreya, and I'm a lawyer by training as well, and I'm a policy research associate at the Dialogue. So the Dialogue is a think tank which works in technology policy domain. We have different verticals related to internet governance, data, international data governance, privacy, and all of that. At the Dialogue, my research areas pertain to platform regulation, free speech, and digital rights. I am really thankful for inviting me to this panel, and I really look forward to a really enlightening discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you all of you once again to agree to be a part of this panel. So a little bit about the Institute. We are, and I think I would call it a global institute because we have people all the way from Brazil to India to Philippines being a part of this institute. We are headquartered at Berlin. And I think that's pretty much about the Institute. The name says it all. It is an Institute for the Internet and Just Society. We do a lot of policy work. Some of our recent publications also include privacy in the age of COVID-19, especially with track and trace programs all across the world going on. I think that's what we hope to achieve through this organization is democratization of fundamental freedoms and fundamental rights all across the world. What we at the Digital Human Rights Cycle have sought to do over the past year is track and hopefully establish a pattern of social media movements that have occurred across the world. And try to have a blueprint of how such social media movements have been used to denounce human rights abuses all across the world. But as we all know, social media is not all good. With certain virtues, it does have its downfalls. And today we are here to discuss some of the downfalls, which pertains to fake news and misinformation, and especially focus to the global south because I am from the global south and I thought it would be an interesting proposition to have. And secondly, while I was researching And while I was trying to write something on the global south and fake news, there seems to be a dearth of information which pertains to the global south. Mostly articles, researchers, thinkers, academics have focused on the global north, especially when it comes to the recent elections and the election manipulations in the US. So I just wanted to move away from that and hopefully have a discourse going on in terms of the global south. And I'm once again very thankful for the three of you to be a part of this panel. I think we can start with the questions if you don't mind. If you have any opening statements, I would love to hear them. Other than that, I think we can delve into the questions and we can start discussing what we are here to discuss. Should I just then go ahead and discuss the
Yes,
question?
please go ahead. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes,
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So firstly, we're going to start evaluating the benefits of social media movements. I know, like I said, social media obviously is not all bad or all good. So let's start with some of the nice things about social media movements, especially when it comes to denouncing of human rights abuses and how successful or how unsuccessful have they been in the past. So my first question is, social media has the power to bring to light various human rights abuses, which it has done in the recent past, even from the most cornermost areas of the world, in order to get international attention. What do you foresee some of the strategies that can be adopted by such movements to make them even more effective, if possible? Can we have, I think anybody can go ahead, or you want me to ask somebody? Okay, let's start with Apar.
Yeah, Roshan, it may be better if we just if we can hear initial thoughts or views, or you can
Okay,
prompt conversation. So
perfect.
uh, we can possibly do it as initial remarks and then open it up for conversation
Perfect.
around the specific tracks which you have built.
Yeah.
Because question by question, and I went through them, may
There are
become.
a lot of questions. Yeah. So that's
Yeah,
why I
yeah,
just
yeah. So we may not be, just in terms of
able
interest of
to,
time, I don't think so. We may be able to cover everything. So
of
we
course.
may like to just do it track by track. Like that's just a suggestion. Others may, if you have a better idea how to structure this, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm imposing myself. I
No,
just
no,
want.
no. Of course, Apar. All
That's
inputs are
what Apar is saying. It makes perfect sense. That would be a good way of starting the discussion, and then we can take it forward.
perfect.
Yeah.
Paco, do you have
And
any
if I
views?
can say,
Yes.
no, that I agree with the rest of the panel, especially because I haven't actually seen any of the questions yet.
Okay,
So
perfect.
I
Okay, so
haven't, so I'll just go with what you guys
yeah,
think is right.
perfect. So let me just start with what are the benefits of social media movements. Let's just start with something very simple and very basic, and then we delve hopefully into more of the intricacies and more of the issues that pertain to social media movements, especially when it comes to human rights abuses across the world. So, Apar, do you mind going first when it comes to benefits of social media movements generally?
So social media movements, essentially when they did start, so IFF comes from a social media movement. So IFF essentially benefits from the Save the Internet campaign, which was much broader than IFF, in which several people came together on the issue of network neutrality in India around 2016. And through this large movement, which was led by volunteers, we got adequate net neutrality protections, not only against internet service providers, but were also able to push back against zero-rated platform, which could have locked in and then shaped user experience for a long period of time. So social media by itself, when it does lead to movements, at its very root holds a democratic promise. It is messy, and at that same point in time, however, much more recently, there has been concern that these can be synthetic movements, these can be manufactured, or may also be susceptible to a much more populist appeals where individual rights may be threatened. So I'll stop here, but there are benefits to social media movements because at its very root, the internet is a democratic medium, in the sense as the UN rapporteurs have consistently expressed. It provides the facility for individuals for the first time, possibly, to broadcast to large audiences with very low friction.
Thank you so much, Apar. And yes, I remember IFF is a byproduct of a social media movement, which was fueled through Facebook. Surprisingly, because it was anti-Facebook at the time. But yeah, Paco, if you have any views.
Sure. No, definitely. So I agree, that, social media movements definitely do a lot of good. We've mentioned how they can do some bad, but they do a lot of good. And I think the best way for me to discuss it really is more of a historical example from the Philippines that, I don't know if you know this, but the Philippines, we used to be ruled by a dictatorship for several years. And we finally toppled the dictatorship after a few decades through a bloodless revolution, like people power. And key to that movement back then was the radio. People use the radio to really talk to each other, coordinate. Let's move the rallies this way. There are police on this other street, take another one, and that became the means of connecting people and directing people who had the same these same like-minded ideas on what they wanted in terms of democracy to towards a successful political movement, and that led to the toppling of Marcos as a dictator in the 80s. And then again in the early 2000s, we had what we called People Power 2. And this again was, this was again to remove a corrupt official from sitting president. And behind that, they said that the technology that drove that was text messaging, because SMS, because people would be texting, they'd have these these chains, these text message chains where you pass it along, and in that way they were able to create the momentum and the organization to really push this again, another political movement. And and then today, of course, we're faced with more political challenges as well. And of course, people say that, okay, the next people power. Of course, we're not discussing why we always need people power revolutions, right? But that the next one would be driven by social media, without a doubt. So I think, with just that, that quick little story there, I think it really captures the power of technology, in this case, social media, to drive political change and really meaningful change throughout an entire country. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Paco. That was very interesting and insightful. Shruti?
Yeah. Is my connection stable? Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
A bit patchy.
Okay. Yeah, I think my co-panelists have covered most of the things. I would just like in today's time, like any state, be it any country, the most important component of any country is the people, the citizens. And it's important to empower the people of a country in order to ensure that the state runs as per the principles of democracy, rule of law. And social media in today's time is instance, there can be a human rights abuse in one country, in a village, or just wait. Just wait. Is it better now? Okay. So I was just saying that social media is a very important tool for empowering the people, the citizens of any country. Like any abuse that I am facing, any challenge that I have, I can use social media to make others aware about it. People sitting thousands of miles away from me can know what is happening with me, what is happening in my country, in my state. And this way, like, awareness can be increased, issues can be better be known by people. So this is an important way that social media has been helpful. Other than that, we can get help from others. We can just increase awareness about the issues ongoing in different countries. There are many kinds of issues that's going on in Myanmar or other places like China and so on. We've been able to know about it only owing to the social media platforms. So it's important that the social media platforms function as, and they're kept free in nature, because freedom of the social media platforms is the most important tool and factor to ensure that the country is democratic in nature. So yeah, it's important to protect democracy. It's important for ensuring better access for the people, and it's important for people to like understand what's happening around them, and just to aid and assist each other. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Shruti. That's absolutely right. Right, we need to inform the people. We need to inform of the atrocities that are happening in like, few of the examples that you mentioned: Myanmar, China, with the Uyghur Muslims, with Rohingyas. It seems to be a very abysmal, dismal situation, which has been brought to light by mostly social media movements that have been that have had concerted efforts to work towards that. I just have one, like, because we are all from the global south, I was just wondering, how can we, like, we have movements like the Me Too movement, which was initially started in the United States, or we have movements like Black Lives Matter, again started in the United States. How do you think that some of these movements can be contextualized, or in fact even be adapted to a global south perspective? We can take the example of India or Philippines to further our agenda, but I just would like to understand how, firstly, are they different from the global north perspective, and secondly, how can we actually adopt these sort of movements to some of the unique challenges of the global south, which firstly means that not everybody has access to internet, not everybody is technology literate. Even if they do have access to internet, they are not technologically literate. They do not, they probably are in echo chambers with their own views. So how do we actually go about propagating some counter views or contrary views that may be there? And these are some of the challenges that we can face as a global south country. So if you like, Apar, if you don't mind going first again. I'm sorry, I'll change the thing and when we go to the next segment. But Apar, why don't you go ahead? Yes.
So, just to draw greater specificity, Roshan, what would be, and sorry, the way I would best approach is as a conversation with you and the other panelists as well. What, in your view, would be a ideal movement which you have seen? Let's talk a little more tangibly, which has happened in the global south. And what is one which has gone horribly wrong? I think that's a good way of just assessing for ourselves as to how is the internet interacting with movements much more broadly, which are happening relatively at a much quicker pace now. So for me, those two examples would be something which has happened very positively, is again something within the domain of digital rights, which is something like Save the Internet, or and something which has gone terribly wrong could be the frequent amount of political canvassing which takes place quite often to target certain vulnerable communities and minorities in a much more polarized climate, which is sometimes dependent on how the algorithms work. And I won't be indicating specific instances of that, but it plays in with a wider media ecology in India, which also includes within it broadcast television. For instance, the recent prosecution of young climate justice campaigners in India, including Disha Ravi. So that's just one example where there was a constant goading of the government to prosecute them for about 2 to 3 days for just signaling that there should be a greater support for the farmers' protest. Now, that's why I would say that it's not only the social movement, but which is spurred by which is spurred online, and the crowds which gather online. It's also the intended impacts of that, because we are quite often seeing a sense of tribalism forming online in which people take positions for and against. And ultimately, as people who believe in democratic values, where conversation may be prized, even a diversity of viewpoints we don't agree with may be prized. However, at that same point in time, certain calls and threats, abuse, or use of the law in systems where the rule of law framework itself may be used or misused or abused as a real threat to people. So that's why I would say that social movements which are occurring online are not removed from the reality of the rule of law framework, the social structures which exist, and especially in the social south, where rule of law is sometimes not all what it should be in its idealized form and manner.
Thank you so much, Apar. And like, because I will answer your question that you had earlier, what is the one movement that you can think of? And the one movement that I can think of was the net neutrality fight that we had much earlier on, which was completely mobilized through social media in India. And we fought for net neutrality by canvassing a large number of people online, right? But some of the things that have gone horribly, horribly wrong is the example of riots that broke out in New Delhi in 2020, February 2020. And this was when the President of the United States was visiting New Delhi, which was again an abysmal show of how we operate as a country. And most of the mobilization had happened through social media, through, like as Apar mentioned, targeting of vulnerable groups of society in the country, and basically curbing, like in an order to curb free speech. And those riots had devastating impact on people's lives, people's livelihoods at that time. And obviously that was overshadowed within a month, barely a month, I would say, by COVID. So it never got to get or garner the attention that it should have, at least on an international platform, in my opinion. But that was a completely targeted campaign against particular vulnerable groups of society through the use of fake news and misinformation. So those would be my sort of remarks that I could think of. But mostly also, when I talk about successful movements, I would consider Black Lives Matter movement also an extremely crucial movement, because it has had repercussions and it has had impact in real time policy. Obviously it hasn't changed drastically, especially in the United States, but it has at least sown some seeds of change, whether it be if it had an impact on the elections that were happening. But other than that, it actually had a real-time policy impact in terms of curbing police action in certain states that were targeted in the movement. But Paco, do you have any views on the same?
Yeah, definitely. So, if I'm not mistaken, like the question is if I can give you like a good example of how social movements have been good, and one that's not so good, right? So, in that sense, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is actually, and this is again in the Philippine context, is when COVID first, happened. And, of course, like many other countries, what do you call this? One of the first reactions was to, pass legislation to respond to this pandemic. And in the Philippines, they came up with this emergency powers law, which would, grant power to the president to move around funds, to do all of these, to prioritize certain projects and programs. But one thing that, social media users in the Philippines noticed is that there was a provision that gave the president the power to take over utility companies that he thought would be essential for the response to COVID-19, to the pandemic. So, and of course, I saw Rashawn, your eyes got big when I mentioned that, because it is a scary provision to have in the law. I think most of you would agree, and I feel it's a good example of how social media movements can have real world impact is because of that, because of the social media noise that came out. That provision was ultimately taken out of the final law, and it did make it into the law, and the government knew, okay, there's certain lines that we can't cross. In terms of the bad side of it, again, it's a COVID related example, but this one it's the politicization of public health as well. And when I talk about public health, I'm not actually just talking about the COVID-19, but also something that happened a few years ago, again in the Philippines, when the use of vaccines was politicized by the current administration as a failed program of the previous. You're familiar with the equation, and this led to this dropping in vaccine confidence among Filipinos. So fast forward to 2020, we have COVID-19, and the remnants of that sentiment still exists now. And because of things like social media and the stigma now that vaccines have, there were surveys done in December of 2020 that found that only 30% of Filipinos actually wanted to or were open to receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. So again, this is again the result of something that happened on social media several years ago, but the impact really can be felt on the ground and for much longer than that single instance. So that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paco. That was so interesting. I did not know that Filipinos were not open to vaccines, because I thought it was just like a global north debate that we had, like the anti-vaxxers, especially in the UK and the US, have been gaining traction, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was quite interesting and insightful. Thank you so much. Shruti, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. Like as you mentioned about the Me Too movement that has taken place in the US. So I think that had quite a big impact in India as well. Like when we saw a couple of politicians, prominent politicians and former judges being prosecuted, and a lot of women got that confidence in themselves that they came out and they talked about the harassment and the problems that they had faced. So this was a movement which was not just confined to US, but it turned to be a global movement in which many people from across the different countries came out. One important thing about how can we take inspiration from such movements of the global north and what the global south, especially India, can learn from it is any movement, and the people who are at the forefront of such movements need to understand that they need to be focused in their approach. Like many a times it's seen that there is a movement, but after a couple of days, it tends to lose its direction. Maybe because of different kind of people and different kind of ideas trying to influence it. So it's always important that your approach is directed and channelized in one way, and the efforts are not misguided. This can only happen if you're aware of the social and the economic realities of the particular community or the country in which your movement is situated. So as we take inspiration from the global north with respect to that it's important to come out, speak about your rights, it's important to make others aware about it and channelize your efforts. It's important to understand the root realities of the country in which you are based. You should understand the kind of challenges that your people face, and then only you can just go about in having a successful movement. Then this governments also, especially the democratic governments, need to understand that many a times these movements tend to become become a law and order concern from some states, and the states tend to curb it, saying that this is not good for the democracy, this can lead to some security concerns and all that. Here, the states also need to understand that curbing a movement is like curbing an idea, which is not something good for a democracy. It's important that you understand what these people are trying to say, understand their problem, and just get into dialogue with them, engage with them, because only when you understand their problem, understand that what they have to offer and what they want from you, can you actually resolve the problems that your people are facing, and only then actually can any good change come, because just suppressing something is not going to lead to any solution. Suppression is just like you're trying to curtail it for some period of time, but after that it may again erupt. So the best way is that both the parties, be it the state or be it the people who are at the forefront of a movement, understand the ideology and the expectation of each other, and then try to balance in their efforts accordingly, because only then a successful result can come out from any of these movements.
Thank you so much, Shruti. And I mean, I think an excellent point made about the Me Too movement, because it did start in the US in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, but it's still very relevant even in 2021, not just in India, but also the United Kingdom, where recently a woman was murdered while she was going back home, and I think she was raped as well. And that also sparked a national conversation in the United Kingdom. It also sparked nationwide protest, especially in London. So clearly the movement hasn't died, and the things just keep happening. And that brings up to my next segment, which is what we will discuss, whether these social media movements are actually effective or not, whether they're a form of armchair activism with no real consequence in real life, or do you think that something more should happen, or do you think that no, what they're doing, what their effect is, or what their impact is it is felt throughout the world, or not even if not throughout the world, but in a particular country, in a particular space? Paco, this time I'll go first to you, if that's fine with you.
Fine. Sorry. Yeah, fine. Sorry. The question was. What was the question? Sorry,
no issues. My question. Yeah, no. My question was, do you think that social media movements are a form of armchair activism, or do you think they actually result in real life consequences? I know we've discussed some very important movements in the previous segment, but do you think that such movements can actually be sustainable in the long run?
Sure. Okay, great. So that's a great question. I think, I myself, of course, my answer is yes. Social media movements are effective, and I feel like I would be a hypocrite to say otherwise, given that I'm from an advocacy group based here in Manila, like I said. And I think the best example, we had some examples earlier, but the best example really is over the past years, COVID-19, the pandemic. Like here in the Philippines, and like in other parts of the world, we've actually been in lockdown for over a year now. So everything that's been happening in terms of pushing for more for good governance, for more transparency, even when it comes to engaging stakeholders or engaging policymakers, this has all been happening online. So for me, that alone, that past year, is evidence that social media movements and this digitization of engagement, while it does have its own challenges, is an effective way of pushing an agenda, shaping public policy. So yeah, that's some quick insight for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paco. Shruti, if you don't mind.
Can you just repeat the question, Roshan? I think my connection was again a little unstable.
No issues. So the question was, do you really think that social media movements, I know we've discussed in the previous segment how social media movements have been successful or not so successful in the past, but whether do you think these social media movements are effective in denouncing human rights abuses and or not, or do you think that they can actually cause real life impact or change, or is just a form of armchair activism that somebody does to make themselves feel good? Okay, I will sign a petition as long as I don't actually have to get on the floor and fight for my rights or fight for somebody else's rights.
No, I think it's a very important thing to understand that even armchair activism is not something which is bad. It's something that helps us get more information, and any information is not bad. It's as much information as we have, it's like we are better empowered. And this is one very important factor of social media movements. Like, yeah, there are a couple of social media movements which have not been able to actually achieve what they wanted to. But on the whole, considering the very fact that people are just coming out, voicing their opinions, speaking for themselves, speaking for others, this itself is a very significant step which ensures that the rule of law and the constitutional principles about which we just keep talking about and which are very critical for any democracy to persist and sustain itself is being protected properly. So social media movements, even if they are not actually successful, there have been many movements which have actually been very successful in attaining the objectives that they tend to, and that's just brilliant. But even if a movement has not been able to achieve its targets, it's still important because it gives courage to others that they can come out and speak for themselves. They can make others aware, and this itself is a form of empowerment. And any form of empowerment, any form of knowledge, any form of information is good for a society. As much as we are empowered, as much as we are able to speak for our rights, it's going to be for our welfare and for the welfare of our community as well. So that ways, all social media movements are important and they all have some or the other significance.
Thank you so much, Shruti. That's absolutely right. But I would like to ask Apar and just, redirect this question to two of the protests or two of the social media movements that I can think of in the recent past. One of them being the Kashmir issue, which was, you have to, I think it was Red for Kashmir or something at the time, when Kashmir was undergoing a lot of drastic changes, putting it mildly, without internet connection, without them actually knowing what was happening to their rights, to their freedoms. And another movement that comes to my mind is also the farmers movement that's still ongoing, but doesn't seem to actually gain any movement on social media. So do you think it's distraction strategies by other parties, or do you think it's just not something that's effectively used the social media to mobilize the masses?
So the premise of social media movements is also that the level of political advocacy which you're doing is towards a stakeholder in government, which will be responsive to public opinion. But it does not take into account what happens if the stakeholder towards whom this is directed stops responding, right? So that's the first challenge here. Secondly, I think the specific examples you're referring to also fall within the realm of core political questions within the greater centralization of power, which is being noticing by several commentators in India, much more towards the union government, right? So if the union government essentially and also parliament abrogates section 370 and reorganizes a state alongside making it a union territory for a certain transitory period of time, which has a history of territorial conflict, then there are very low chances that there'll be political recognition of the individual rights which are agitated by people within it, given that there will be a high sense of nationalism attached to it. Secondly, with respect to the issue of the farmer protests, you brought up whether distraction is a strategy which is used by political opponents through flooding of information. Not only is that one strategy on specific to social media, it's also the larger media ecology, which I'll again talk about. For instance, the mainstream press, the broadcasts which take place through television journalism, if they are not adequately supplementing what's happening on social media by itself will not be having that level of power in order to possibly drive a deeper degree of criticism, question towards core policy programs of any government. Secondly, distraction and flooding is also a form of censorship. It has been recognized not only by the UN Special Rapporteur, but in fact, this is a strategy also talked about by Zainab Tufekci in her book, Twitter and Tear Gas, in which she says essentially that sometimes you can distract large crowds by flooding timelines, and there it inhibits the ability of people to organize effectively together.
Thank you so
If I
much,
could,
Apar. Yes, of course, Paco, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to add. I mean, you got me thinking. All the things the other panelists were saying, and it made me think. Right, if the question really is the effectiveness of social media movements, I think the examples that we're citing, right, as advocates of human rights and democracy, all fall uh, within the same sphere of ideas, right? But I think the best examples of the effectiveness of social media movements is if you look at things like you mentioned, uh, you know, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, Me Too, but also if you just look at like Donald Trump winning the elections in the U.S., like that's I think a great example of the effectiveness of social media movements, given that the power of Twitter, the power of his following on social media, and how that propelled him into the White House. And I think what the only difference between that social media movement and the social media movements we're talking about now are the issues that were being pushed, right? Obviously, those movements tapped into a certain kind of issue that resonated with a certain group of people. And while the issues that we're talking about now resonate with a different group. But so if the question really is just the effectiveness of movements, there's, I think, without a doubt, the only answer to that question has to be yes, given all that's been happening around the world over the last few years. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think Apar has just dropped out, so I was just messaging him for for the next round. But that's absolutely right, and that's where my next segment was going to feed into fake news, misinformation, and how does that actually work in social media movements? Because you spoke about the election of Donald Trump, whether it was actually fueled by people's liking and affinity towards Donald Trump, which is a thing, and people have in fact come out in large numbers and voted for him repeatedly, or was it a mass mobilization of certain narratives that were not being filtered by these social media companies at the time? I think they are now stepping up their game time and time again to make sure that they still actually are equally like at least participating in the democratic processes all across, at least in the United States and the global north, I would say. I don't know how effective regulation or getting social media companies to answer in the global south can lead to any direct results. So if you don't mind, can we just take a 2-minute break just so that we can wait for Apar to join in for the next segment that we have on fake news and misinformation? And then we'll just reconvene in 2 minutes if that's fine.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Perfect.
That's fine.
On fake news and misinformation. Yes, yay, Apar. I'm so glad you're back.
Yeah, I've tethered my phone, so yeah.
Electricity issues, I've been having them too.
It's not an electricity issue. It's my broadband is unstable. It's a lined internet, so sometimes.
Okay. I like how we're talking about fake news, misinformation, and social media and all of this, and then we don't even have internet connections.
No, it's partly due to bad wiring. I don't think so. It's reflective of anything else. So,
Perfect.
but
So
it's working right now. So yeah.
okay, fingers crossed. For next 15 minutes it stays on. So like I said, let's talk about fake news and misinformation and how that has dominated these movements, not just these movements, but just narratives all across the globe and specific to global south, and where I personally have seen and hopefully also researched on is when Facebook was used as a tool of propaganda to conduct a genocide. And while in Myanmar, and while it is been absolved of any liability, any sort of repercussions in the real time, but it did have repercussions of a mass genocide in Myanmar. So clearly social media is not all hunky-dory, and social media movements are clearly not all hunky-dory and can be in the tools of regimes that want to misuse them, can also be used counterintuitively. So what are your views? So what are some of the views that you guys have on fake news and misinformation and how it can be curbed going forward on social media platforms? Shruti, if you don't mind.
Yeah. As you already mentioned that like fake news and misinformation are some of the most prominent challenges right now on the internet, and probably this is the reason that the governments of most of the countries across the world are now trying to pitch in with more stricter regulations. Like this is the argument that they give, that the reason for more regulation is that they need to curtail the fake news and misinformation, which is hampering the rule of law on the social media. So definitely it's important to curtail it, but it's important to understand that what are the actually sustainable solutions which can help us in tackling the issues of fake news and misinformation properly without actually interfering with the fundamental rights of the people. Because the most of the measures that the governments propose to take is around like censorship, like proactive monitoring, traceability. So these kind of tools and these kind of measures have their other dire ramifications in respect of curtailing free speech of the people and hampering and violating their right to privacy. So it's important to understand that while it's important to curtail fake news and misinformation, we do not want to create another challenge for ourselves. We want to curtail and resolve this problem in a way that it's resolved forever and it's not going to lead to another safety concern on the internet. For this, I think the most important way is to make the community guidelines of the platforms more robust. Like while the governments are proposing for more regulations and greater accountability from the platforms, it's definitely important to hold the platforms accountable because they are the people where they are the first person who are actually holding our information or where we are posting whatever we are. But it's important that the government, instead of just coming up with more regulations, it ensures that the community guidelines that these platforms are having, they make it more robust. They should engage in consultations, and I think something similar is happening in US right now, wherein the CEOs of the three most important big techs are undergoing a consultation with the government on is there a need to reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is like the safe harbor provision there. So these kind of consultations is important, and I think this is the most important way that we can actually curtail these challenges, wherein the intermediaries as well as the government understand each other's point of view and engage in meaningful consultations with each other, making the community guidelines better. Other than that, it's important to bridge the digital divide and the brilliance divide which is existing, especially in the global south countries, be it India or be it any other countries of this region. Because when people know that this kind of information can be false, like the ways of detecting fake news, ways of detecting misinformation, and how they can stop it from being disseminated further, what they can do, how they can report, how they can appeal against it. So making people aware about these rights, curtailing the digital divide, awareness, these are some of the important mechanisms. Another important issue is of implementation. Like we see that we already have so many legislations existing, be it under the IPC, be it under the IT Act. It's also important to ensure that we are just not going about making more and more regulations, but also ensure that the regulations that are already existing are being implemented in a proper manner. How many prosecutions are actually taking place against the cyber criminals in the CSAM cases or in the fake news cases? Is it just that we are creating regulations and making more and more people liable against under them, or actually prosecution and punishment is taking place, which is important for creating a true deterrence in the society? So these are some of the important things: meaningful consultations, community guidelines, making them robust, and then looking at the implementation of these some of the regulations that we have. And I think this can be the best way of tackling the issue of fake news.
Thank you so much. That was so comprehensive. I mean, like, I feel like I don't have anything to add here, but I would ask Paco to go ahead and maybe provide his insights.
Sure. Yeah, well, definitely. That was indeed a very comprehensive response. And perhaps the most I can really just do is echo some of the points that were brought up. And those are that, I agree that, there are, when we're talking about adding more regulation, I don't think that that's necessarily the solution to addressing fake news, the problem of disinformation and fake news. In fact, additional regulation, especially in countries where democratic institutions are relatively weak, perhaps like the Philippines. More regulations could actually mean more challenges, more threats to free speech and to democratic values. I'd also like again to echo, the need for that collaboration between not only government but civil society and with the industry itself. There are a couple of two things. I think it was in September of last year. It's when Facebook took down, I think it was almost 100 or so Facebook accounts for what they call coordinated inauthentic behavior, right? And a lot of these Facebook pages that were operating in the Philippines, talking about Philippine issues, were actually from China, and Facebook took that down. So I think that raises the real importance of working closely with the industry, because they, like was previously said, they have the best insight to what's happening on their platform. And another thing, and this is sort of related to the digital divide, I think, is education as well. What we really need when it comes to combating fake news is that critical thinking and the knowledge of how to use and how to sort what's true and what's not on social media. And a lot of that comes down to education. And just to go back again to the collaboration with industry. Here in the Philippines, for example, Facebook Philippines has this movement, this project which they're calling Digital Tayo, which is digital us. And what that movement is they're going around educating people on how to use the platform properly, how to identify what's fake from what's real, and just see how also not just to identify, but also how to use it to advocate for real change, meaningful change. And I think it's these sort of initiatives from the private sector that need to be amplified as well by government and by civil society. And that sort of amplification can only happen with that collaborative approach to addressing society's problems. So yeah, really just echoing a lot
Yes,
of the
I know,
points.
but I think you made a very important point on education. So I completely understand that most of it was echoing, but education was a completely new thing that we could obviously focus on as a Global South perspective. Apar, few comments, then I think we should end, because I think everybody has to go also. I asked for an hour. I don't want to overstep my bounds as well.
No, I think what for future, I think so. What we need to be very attuned to is that we'll see firstly the growth of more and more regulation, and that regulation which will come through, which will be often premised on addressing the social impacts of greater connectivity for people, hence resulting in greater amounts of harms, but also opportunities. The second is it will also be premised on ensuring that, at least ostensibly, ensuring that there's individual liberty and welfare. But quite often, this regulation may be um, not uh, not actually serving those goals. It may be undermining it, because essentially what's happening is that it's a democratically elected government in certain aspects, which may be utilizing regulation towards greater powers of censorship or surveillance towards it, towards controlling the online conversation and ecology, as has happened in traditional forms of media. So I think we'll need to watch out for that. In India, it's already happening to some degree with the information technology rules, and there's extensive analysis on internetfreedom.in relating to it. And I would urge everyone to go and check it out.
Thank you so much. And I know that all of you have messaged that you have prior commitments at 7:30, which is India time, or 10:30 as Manila time. And I just want to say one last time, thank you so much for being a part of this panel. I had an excellent time hosting you guys, and I hope you guys had a good time and a good conversation as well. I will let you guys know when this is published and is published, and I think we'll be publishing it on LinkedIn. So I'm so glad that you all could be members of this panel, and I'm so glad to have your insights and inputs. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was nice talking and sharing this forum.
Yes, of course. And we're
Bye,
hoping.
Paco. Thank you so much for joining in.
And
Thank
we're
you so
hoping
much.
we have like
Yeah.
a event report